Welcome to Magic Arcanum. I'm Ryan Gomez. Behind the scenes is Nicole Letson, and we're so glad you're here because it's story time. Theros Beyond Death just gave us 7 new god creature cards, but Magic has had plenty of others in the past. So today, we're going to take a look back at where these awe-inspiring legends came from. But first, let me say thank you to everyone who helps make this show possible with their support on Patreon. You can become a lore mage and get your name in the credits, and anyone who pledges anything gets invited to our exclusive Discord server. So go ahead and use the link down below to check it out. Okay, so a history of gods. It all starts in Magic's first set with a sorcery. Wrath of God was the first Magic card to mention any sort of god, but it comes from a point in time when they used real-world references instead of their own lore. At the same time, we saw creatures like Sarah Angel, who is an angel from the Church of Sarah, where they worshipped the planeswalker Sarah as if she were a goddess, but she was in fact not. Now for the rest of Magic's history, we'll see a similar division. Angels and demons will appear on many planes, often together, but usually detached from any sort of actual god. Anytime you're using religious icons in your fantasy setting, be it a game or a movie or a book or comic, whatever, you have to be careful. And I think Wizards of the Coast played it pretty safe by not having angels and demons and gods all together out of fear of upsetting any of their player base. Or the parents of their player base, more likely. Anyway, Wrath of God is the namesake, or nickname sake, of any card today that wipes away all the creatures on the board. We call these Wraths. And a modern example would be Shatter the Sky. Proceeding chronologically, the next god we get is Corona the False God from a set called Scourge. Now, I pride myself on having a smart audience, so you guys can all probably tell Corona's not a real god. I mean, it's right there in the title. She is instead what we call an avatar. Magic has had many avatars, and so many that I could probably do a whole video just on them, but while they are indeed quite powerful, they are not gods for the purpose of today's discussion. But Ryan, what's the difference? Well, an avatar is a projection of power, usually with a singular focus. Take Avatar of Might, for example. This guy is strong. He cares about things being strong, and you're not going to have much of a conversation with him beyond that. But an actual god has their own motivations and ideas beyond simple things like be strong. So that's the difference. Let's jump all the way up to the original Ravnica block, where we find a rare land called Godless Shrine. Even though the Orzhov Syndicate has angels and is a church, they worship money, not a god. So, Godless Shrine. But stick this one in your pocket for later, because we're going to come back to it. Shadowmoor block had a cycle of 10 demigods, but they were really all avatar spirits. So there go those avatars, pretending to be gods again. Also, note the use of the word demigod. We're going to see that again in Theros Beyond Death, but we're not there yet. Over on Alara, we get the god trackers. They would follow the plane's largest creatures and bring them offerings of food to help keep them calm. Also on Alara, we had Progenitus, who is treated as a sort of god Hydra. But guess what? Avatar, again. Kamigawa, meanwhile, had the Myojin, powerful spirits that would have invulnerability as long as they kept their divinity counter, but they could cash that in for an extremely powerful effect. Mark Rosewater has said if they were designing those cards today, they would be all gods, but since that type line didn't exist back then, they're just spirits. Oh, and I almost forgot. Over on Zendikar, they used to worship the Eldrazi as gods thousands of years after they had been locked up, and everyone forgot about all the devastation and damage they had actually caused. You can see this best depicted on Shrine of the Forgotten Gods. and Eily, Eternal Pilgrim, tried to feed Jace to Ulamog as like a sacrifice before Jace was able to break free. But again, as powerful as the Eldrazi are, they are not gods. To get real gods, we have to go to Theros, a plane based on Greek mythology. Here we get a whole pantheon of gods, and I am going to talk about them each individually. But first, let's take a look at the theme and mechanics behind them. On Theros, the gods are a product of people's devotion. Long ago, the Titans walked the plane, devastating everything as they went. In their desperation, people began to pray for help, and those prayers manifested in the gods. Each of the gods of Theros is also an enchantment, and much of their interaction with the people of Theros comes through enchantment magic. Now, as these gods are the embodiment of an idea, they are indestructible, because like V for Vendetta taught us, you can't kill an idea. Or was that Batman? Same thing, whatever. The gods of Theros can only attack or block as creatures if you have enough devotion to their color or colors, representing that they only exist thanks to the belief of their followers. So, being nearly impossible to kill and situationally able to attack and block, those are the hallmarks of the gods of Theros. Let's take a look at the entire pantheon. We'll start with Helia God of the sun. He's a great example of what happens when you push white ideology too far. By the time we get to Theros Beyond Death, he is insisting he be the only god worshipped and is trying to push the others out of view. Thassa, god of the sea. So even though she's female and really a goddess, they still just call her a god, mostly to save space on the cards. They don't have to put god or goddess in the rules text. Thassa has her own problems with Kiora, the planeswalker, who stole her bident. Erebos, god of the dead, he watches over the underworld and argues with Heliod quite a bit about what's fair and appropriate when it comes to dealing with mortals. At the end of Theros Beyond Death, he punishes Heliod by placing him underneath a massive boulder, which kind of answers the age-old question, can a god make a rock so big that a god can't lift it? Perforos, god of the forge, gives us a look at the creative and constructive side of Red. This guy likes to build things rather than tear them down, and he even made the sword that wound up in the hands of Elspeth during her quest for knighthood, which I cover in another video, so go check that one out in case you missed it. Leah, god of the hunt, is the last of our monocolored gods. Her bow is one of my favorite artifacts because it has 4 different abilities which represent 4 different seasons. One time I made a deck with Bow of Nylea and Spear of Heliod. The idea being if your opponent attacks you with a creature, kill it with the spear. If they don't, use the bow to gain some life, and eventually they would just fall so far behind you they had no hope of catching up. I was testing this against my brother, who then hit me with a wear and tear, and I am so salty about it to this day. I'm not even going to put that card on the screen. You can go look it up yourselves. Anyway, let's talk about the multicolored gods real quick. There's Afara, god of the Polis. Okay, god of the sun, god of the sea, those are easy to understand, but what is a polis? Well, it's a real Greek word that means city. So Afara watches over the civilized sections of Theros. Karametra, god of the harvest. She's the sister of god of the hunt, and she's seen as a sort of protective and nurturing god, but don't be fooled, because her weapon is a scythe, and it is used for cutting down wheat just as often as it's used for cutting down bad guys. Mogis and Iroas, I'm going to do them together because they are twins, and they represent the different sides of war. Mogis is the dark and dirty side, and he is a minotaur with a bull upper half and human legs. And Iroas represents the honorable fighting battles, and he is a centaur, but the bottom half is a bull and the top half is a person. So together, the two of them make one whole bull and one whole person. Then we have Phoenix, god of liars, cheats, and Decepticons. Wait, Phoenix is the god of deception and made the planeswalker Ashiok invisible to the other gods for the lulz. Athreos, god of passage, that's an interesting one. He gathers up people who have died and transports them to the underworld by crossing the 5 rivers that ring the world. His big walking stick turns into a boat. Pharika, god of affliction, kind of has a misleading name. She actually knows a lot of cures and remedies as well. She's also the mother of all Gorgons on Theros, and she has hidden medical secrets in the blood of dangerous animals like basilisks. Keranos, god of storms, can grant people visions of the future, but he doesn't typically like mortals because he thinks they're too reckless. Yes, the guy whose signature move is throwing lightning everywhere thinks humans are too reckless. I don't get it either. Krufix, god of horizons. Now this one's interesting. He claims to be the oldest of the gods, having witnessed the birth of everyone else, and he seems to be the most knowledgeable. He even knows about planeswalkers, and what he knows from these planeswalkers scares him. He figures if the Eldrazi, the Phyrexians, or even Nicole Bolus himself were to ever come to Theros, the gods there would not be powerful enough to stop any of them. And that leaves us with Xenagos, who's another special case because he started as a planeswalker, but he ascended to godhood and then was killed by Elspeth. So for the last 5 or 6 years, people have wondered what's going to happen with a gap in the red and green section of the Pantheon. Well, it turns out there was another red and green god, and that's Klothys. She was down in the underworld keeping a lid on the Titans, but now she is obsessed with keeping Elspeth from escaping her fate. So those are the gods of Theros, and on our current visit to the plane, we've seen the rise of several demigods. So let's talk about them real quick. A demigod is a mortal who has been granted a divine rank, and in the story, they are the chosen champions of their respective matching gods. So that's what makes Daxos and his friends true demigods as opposed to the ones from Shadowmoor who were just spirit avatars. The gods of the original Theros block proved to be quite popular, and it wasn't long before we saw another batch of gods on another plane, this time a place called Amonkhet. Amonkhet was the base of operations for Nicole Bolus. It's where he raised his eternal army and prepared them for the invasion of Ravnica, but it wasn't always his personal playground. Originally, Amonkhet had 8 gods of its own, but when Nicole Bolus arrived, he mind-wiped all of them, put 3 into storage for later, and left the other 5 to run things in his absence. Now make no mistake, the gods on this plane are still supremely powerful magical beings, but they walk among the citizens on this plane instead of lording over them and messing with them through enchantments. And, much like their counterparts on Theros, these gods are also indestructible and can't attack or block unless specific conditions are met, although these ones are always a creature. Oketra, Kefnit, Bantu, Ronus, and Hazaret are the 5 gods of Amonkhet, overseeing the 5 trials. We eventually learned that Bantu had helped Nicole Bolus invade the plane all those years ago as part of her own ambition for power. When Nicole Bolus returned to collect his eternal army, he also unleashed the 3 gods he had been saving for just such an occasion. Their original names have been lost to time, so we only know them as the Scarab God, the Scorpion God, and the Locust God. Now these 3 behaved quite a bit differently. They could always attack and block, but they were not indestructible. Instead, when they died, they would go back to your hand to be recast again later. They were still supremely powerful and instrumental in ushering in the Hour of Devastation. The Scorpion God in particular managed to kill Ronus, Oketra, and Kefnit. Bantu was killed by Nicole Bolus, and only Hazaret managed to survive and escape the fallen city. Those dead gods would return as eternalized versions of themselves on Ravnica during the War of the Spark. This time they are no longer indestructible and behave more like the Scorpion God and his friends. They are still always creatures, though, and can always attack and block. They don't need any sort of devotion to help make that happen. Now, remember when we talked about Godless Shrine earlier and how it's part of the original Ravnica landscape? Turns out Ravnica has not been without gods this whole time. While the Orzhov may not have been worshipping them, other guilds certainly were. And that's where we get Ilharg, the Razeborn. He behaves a lot like the Eternalized gods because he completes that 5-color cycle. Remember, Hazaret was not killed and thus did not come back as a zombified version of herself. There is also Priest of the Forgotten Gods, which suggests there could be even more gods lurking in the Undercity of Ravnica or somewhere beyond. There is one other god I cannot leave out, and that is Nicole's namesake, Nicole Bolus, a self-made god, or god pharaoh, as it were. You see, his entire life, Nicole Bolus had wanted to be the ultimate power in the multiverse. Stealing all of the sparks from all of the planeswalkers on Ravnica was his end game. And leading up to that, he crowned himself God Pharaoh, ruler of Amonkhet, and soon, everything else. Unfortunately, he was stopped by one of the very gods he had enslaved on his way towards ultimate power. Bantu, encouraged by Liliana, managed to attack Nicol Bolas at the conclusion of War of the Spark, ruining the Elder Spell and weakening Bolas enough that Ugin could lock him away forever. So those are the existing gods as we know them today. Between Theros, Amonkhet, and Ravnica, we've seen gods of all colors, all types, and with all sorts of different abilities. There are ways to beat them, though. Cards like Deicide and Hour of Glory have specific text that goes after gods, and weapons like Godsend and Shadow Spear can also help you get them off the table. Even with these tools, it is hard to kill a god, and once they're on the battlefield and the conditions are right, they are extremely powerful. So that only leaves us with one question. What is the next batch of gods going to look like? At some point in Magic's future, we are likely going to visit a plane called Kaldheim, inspired by Norse mythology the same way Theros was Greek. Norse mythology has its own gods. This is actually where Thor and Loki come from. No, they are not owned by Marvel, I promise. I'm going to call a super long shot here. I think within the next 2 years, we will go to Kaldheim and we will see gods. And they will start the game not in your deck, maybe in the command zone or maybe in exile or something. And yes, that's true for every format. Then, when the right conditions are met, the god comes into play without even having to be cast. For a warrior like Thor, maybe it's attacking with 3 or more creatures. A trickster like Loki, maybe he wants to see you counter a spell or draw extra cards or something, I don't know. The gods wouldn't stay in play long, maybe just until your next turn or so they're constantly popping in and out, showing up just long enough to have an impact before vanishing back to their own realm. So that's my prediction, and I guess we'll know in like a year or 2 if I'm even close to being right. While we're waiting, we might as well kill some time with a mustache minute, right? Ready? Here we go. Hey, God Hunter Octopus. Would you even know what to do with a god if you caught one? Most of the gods on your plane will turn you into straight calamari. Just swim in your own lane, friend. Can somebody explain to me how a silent submarine does more for your devotion to blue with no crew than an actual living merfolk who has already earned Thassa's favor? No? Okay. Colored artifacts have actually made devotion behave pretty strangely now. If you put 4 things in 4 different glass caskets, Helia suddenly wants to fight. I'm not going to try and cast all of the gods, but I guess we could do the main Theros 5. For Perforos, I like Bautista! And then, since we're already in Guardians of the Galaxy territory, for Nylea, let's use Zoe Saldana. Oh, what? She's already green. I think John Hamm would make a good Heliod. He can pull off the whole vain and paranoid thing while also still being inhumanly good looking. right? For Erebos, we need somebody more sinister and creepy. I'm thinking Cillian Murphy. He's got that sort of skeleton face cheekbone thing going on there. And for Thassa, I think Charlize Theron has both the grace and the willingness to put live lobsters in her hair that role really requires. Okay, that's enough of that. Which god do you think is the most powerful of all time? Let me know down in the comments. Then make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the great stories you'll only find here on Magic Arcanum. We'll see ya!